Book 2. As the sunlight came into the rooms each morning, my heart sang with delight for the goodness of life and happiness that was mine. I loved my family more than anything, and I had never dreamed that one's children could be so sweet and such a joy to have. I was determined to keep myself looking as nice as possible, regardless of the many tasks. I suppose I can thank my mother for this, for I never remember seeing her untidy or her hair uncombed. My aunts, father's sisters, impressed me as a young girl with their immaculate starched English aprons, their beautiful long hair dressed neatly on top of their head. Each day after lunch, I put on an afternoon dress which was clean and attractive. I always sewed them myself. This lifted my spirits and actually rested me. Above all, it helped me to respect myself. This way, I could enjoy the children more and those who called to see us. Our third son, Paul Cole, was born May 20th, 1933. The day before, when I had become so tired of the seeming dragging of time, I had gone out and rode on the drill with MD as he planted grain. How sunny and beautiful the day. Our new little son had all the attributes the other children had, plus a boundless energy, which kept his parents, brothers and sister, at their wits' end when he became a little older. Gerald and Beth were in school. The big yellow bus came up the road each morning at an early hour, and away they went with books and lunch pails under their arms. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, and with his New Deal program had pulled us out of the Depression and given people new hope and confidence in their country. CC camps were set up in the wilderness, forests, and parks to give youth work. While moving so frequently, we had never been able to acquire many possessions of our own. All we needed during this time, besides the beautiful wicker baby carriage we had bought for Gerald when he was a baby, the little pink crib MD had made for the babies, and the low rocker I rocked them in, was a car, our clothes and money. Now that we were settled, we had very little money, but dreams as only the young dare have. It was not long, however, until we had quite a collection of interesting things, as well as a good-sized menagerie of animals and so forth. We certainly were in the farming business, more than we had ever imagined. As the children grew, we acquired a phonograph. The first morning as I played it, while doing my household tasks, I thought, how wonderful. I fairly floated on air as I listened to the beautiful strains of Dvorak's Humoresque. Now we have music continually in the home, even to eat our meals by. It will help us, I thought, never to speak cross to one another or the children. I found out it wasn't always as effective as I had imagined. I suppose the very first, most necessary and less desirable possession was the outside privy or little house in the back. One day MD decided it was time to give it a new resting place, so he hitched a team onto it. One horse was young and skittish. I was in the kitchen when suddenly I heard a loud crashing, dragging, and shouts of, "Whoa, whoa!" Then I saw the team with the little house dashing and crashing through the dooryard with MD running behind, desperately trying to keep hold of the reins, circling past the kitchen door, cutting a wide circle or swath through the yard, back to where they had started from, and finally coming to a stop. All I can say is that it was exciting while it lasted, and I imagine that little house, in all the history of outhouses, was the only one to have such a swift ride. The old hen hatcher was a must on every farm. MD built a real sturdy one, and we set our hens in it every spring, raising fryers for our summer and winter eating. It was on this hatcher, when the Hubbard squash had been nipped with the frost, for that made them sweeter, that I wrestled dangerously with a hatchet to prepare them for pies. The harder they were on the outside, the tastier would be the pies, so I had heard. I never found out for sure. I chopped, cut, and peeled for hours to get the bright orange meat ready to cook, strain, and season. But I must say the finished product was delicious to taste. Our Model A Ford, which we had acquired, was a luxury. We felt almost rich indeed as we rode in it. It lasted for years. Our only repair bill on it cost $1.90. One day, as I drove it down the lane, the motor or engine fell down, so we decided a new car was in order. Once when I was driving it on West Oneida State with the children, the right back wheel came off and went rolling down the street ahead of us. We slid some distance, then sat and watched it go down the road. I must not forget MD's invention, the electric churn. I must admit I was always slow to adopt or try new things. Not MD. If he could, he would have had a push button do everything on the place as soon as we acquired electricity. We had churned our butter by hand, much to his disgust. He decided to have something more advanced. He sawed a square hole in the table on the back porch. He fit the glass churn into it while it was being power turned, then rigged it up to go. I was so excited, no more slow hand churning. We all waited and watched eagerly as he turned the switch. The poor little churn shook up and down so fast, the beaters turned so swiftly, we couldn't see them move, and the butter never had time to separate from the buttermilk. The result was hardly edible. Needless to say, we went back to churning by hand. Our menagerie was the most interesting ever heard of. There were never to be forgotten animal individuals on that farm. The dogs, Ring, the faithful and loyal, Scott, the vain, beautiful extrovert and favorite of all, except tall men whom he disliked and never failed to show it by nipping their heels. We swore he was half-human. Firefly, the children's pony, gentle enough but wily, her eyes ever cast on a swift exit if it looked as though someone may slip a bridle over her head. Hans, the sly horse, looking for a gate to unlock, for that was his sin, or planning ways to outwit anyone who attempted to guide him along the crop rows as the cultivating was being done. MD cured him for a while at least of this habit by manipulating a lock with his lips when he charged the lock with electricity. Never did an animal sit so straight upon his haunches so fast. There was Abdul, the show bull. Gerald had bought him as a calf, his ebony fur glistening with luster as the sunlight danced upon it. His hooves and horns were polished to a fine finish. A thing of beauty he was as Gerald groomed him for the coming county fair. The sly cat gave the dogs a wide berth as he contemplated his next playful trick on anyone who was near. The tricky gander and his lady friend, the goose, waddling as near the house as they dared, keeping a wary eye on Scott, almost defying him to touch them. Many times they had gone round and round in a free-for-all fight, feathers flying, their screaming, squawking, and barking resounding through the neighborhood. More than one early morning cattle buyer thought the hounds of hell had him when the old gander ran noiselessly behind him in the pre-dawn, flew to his shoulders, and flapped his wings mightily against the poor man's ears. This gander eventually met his fate at the hands, or I should say horns of Jody, the bull, a lesser character who lived with the cows for a short time. Percy the owl was Frank's summer hobby. Also there was the great horned owl, stuffed and mounted, the ghost of the boys' room, who stared at me each time I entered. It finally disintegrated with dust and age. For a few days, each spring, the farm and neighborhood was made odoriferous by MD faithfully reducing the manure piles, which had winter grown to the size of a teepee, scattering it in the fields to fertilize next season's crops. This was done with a team of horses hitched to a manure spreader. Sometimes he scattered the manure by hand, while each creature, person, even the honeybees basked in the goodness of just being alive, for the earth was afire with springtime. I remember stepping to the kitchen door and shouting gleefully to MD as he worked in the barnyard leavings, "Hello, honey dipper," at which he replied with some flippant remark, then laughed. Scott and Ring, lying in the sun, now and then flicked an ear to rid themselves of a bothersome fly. Yes, we were earthy. This was the life we had been born into, as our parents were before us. A small world, but we loved the land, and our children acquired great knowledge of the outdoors from experience. I have felt throughout my life, of all the places in the world, this was the more desirable to raise a family. Our children could grow up in the arms of nature and the ever-healing earth. I remember one night with fondness. Summer rain was dripping from the eaves. The fragrance of lilacs, Frank had planted them for me underneath the window, came in the open window. How peaceful and serene it was, with the night wrapped around us. MD and myself lay listening to the steady beat of the raindrops tinkling against the milk buckets outside, our little ones fast asleep in their beds. I remember so well MD saying, "Tonight is a happy one, for all our little ones are safe in their warm beds." How often I have thought of that night throughout my life when the little ones grew up and went away. Scott, as a puppy, was a round ball of gold and white fluff. We thought he was the most beautiful puppy we had ever seen. He and Paul were the same age, but at 2 years, Scott was a full-grown, handsome dog with a tremendous personality. Paul was yet a tiny, yellow-curled little boy who teased Scott by sticking his lingers in Scott's ears or blowing in them, then laughing. Whereupon Scott grabbed his small, white arm between his huge jaws, shaking him soundly. But there never was so much as a tooth print or scratch on the tender skin. A common sight on a hot summer's day was Scott stretched out on the damp earth in the coolness and shade of the catnip bed north of the house, and a tiny boy lying stretched out on the top of his soft fur, both fast asleep. Percy the owl was Frank's pet. They had a great fondness for each other. He had found Percy as a fledgling, trained and faithfully fed him mice each day. Sometimes I think it kept him quite busy. At that time, Frank was not overly tall, rather sturdy and short in stature. He wore a pair of high-topped shoes. They came to his knees. Perhaps they were cast-offs of Gerald's. He walked proudly each day with Percy. About all one noticed was his mop of blonde hair, his shoes and Percy perched on top of his shoulder, his great round eyes rolling in every direction. Percy grew up finally and flew away to find his own kind, leaving all of us a little sad. At an early age, Frank proved to be an artist at cutting out paper animals and was quite famous at this among the relatives, friends, and neighbors. Gerald, while a tiny boy, began gathering seeds wherever he went, planting them in a special place in the garden. The result was rows and rows of little seedling trees. The tiny plants pushed through the earth, while everyone watched their progress with wonder. Today, some of those little seedlings are now full-grown trees, which Gerald planted so long ago on the farm. In a recent letter, Gerald reminded me of the time the neighbor's cat jumped on his head, scratched his face, and nearly tore an ear off. He came home with blood running down his face and shirt front. What a frightening sight. We were surprised indeed to see his ear grow back to normal and the deep scratches heal. This was not unusual for Gerald, however, as he usually had some part of his face skinned regularly. Strange how a youngster's cuts and scratches can so readily heal. He also reminded me of the day I spent helping him build a little hay derrick with cord string and rather thick willows from the Lombardy trees. With a tiny hay fork, he used the mowed grass for hay. Surprisingly, it really worked. And what fun we had that day. How happy the memory. Gerald must have been about 8 years of age. Though she played with her brothers in the fields and the river hill, Beth was by no means a tomboy. She was very demure. At an early age, she was already showing a sense of femininity. She loved to put on a clean, pretty dress and have me dress her gold with brown shades of hair, then stand sedately on a chair while I put the finishing touches to her. At 9 months, she was walking and climbing on chairs. Her first doll came to a sad end when she left it lying in the yard, and a neighbor boy took a hoe and chopped off its head. How she cried. Her pet kitten also met with an accident. She was not yet 2 years old. She loved and squeezed it so hard it choked to death. With a sad and bewildered face, she held it up, wanting to know what was the matter with it. I can see her tearful face as if it were yesterday. The summers of her childhood were spent with her brothers, running through the fields, watching anxiously as Scott and Ring furiously dug the squirrel holes. There were picnics on the banks of Bear River. Each new day held forth some surprise. When she was 3 or 4 years of age, she and Gerald were looking at his traps he had set at the top of the hill. One day we saw her running to the house. Breathlessly, she cried, "Come quick, a big animal is pulling Gerald down its hole." We started running with terrible visions of a huge bear in Gerald's lifeless body. When we arrived at the spot, sure enough, a rock chuck had been caught in the trap and had backed down its hole, with Gerald holding on to the chain for dear life. When she was a little older, she practically raised Paul, as I was working in the Relief Society presidency in the 3rd Ward, and was gone from home much of the time. She was a little mother to him. In September, when the fields rang with the music of cicadas singing, the children climbed into the big yellow school bus. Beth broke a record her first year by reading more books than anyone in the 1st grade. The teachers from then on expected her brothers and sister to do the same. One spring, Paul had numerous little bottles tied to and hanging from the limbs of the box elder trees. The sun was shining, and honeybees in great hordes were buzzing around each twig. Paul worked diligently, watching and waiting, saying he would make sugar. It's a wonder the bees didn't retaliate for having their territory invaded, for sure enough, the sap was running into each little bottle. To everyone's surprise, after a long process of waiting, pouring and slowly boiling, the result was some beautiful cream-colored sugar, pleasant to the taste. We never had to worry about the youngsters getting into mischief. They were far too busy with their exciting adventures and daily chores. About twice a week, we got into our Ford, took our cream to town, bought groceries and other necessary things such as coal oil for the lamps. Occasionally, MD and myself would make a hurried trip to town for some needed piece of machinery, leaving the children alone. I can see them grouped together in the south window, those little faces watching anxiously for our return. The children's teachers marveled at the wealth of knowledge they possessed about everything in general, especially anything to do with nature, animals, birds, and the great outdoors. I suppose their many hours and days of exploring the hills and fields paid off in a big way. All too soon the precious years slipped away, and if we thought the children were busy with their many projects while very young, they were much more so in their school years. Gerald was active in the Future Fanners of America. I remember his first agriculture teacher, Yale Holland, who took such an interest in him. He came to see us often and started taking Gerald, who was very young, with the older members of his judging team to judge stock. Gerald bought a bull calf, which grew into a beautiful show animal. Soon we were taking him to fairs, and always he went to the annual Black and White Day in Richmond. Abdul, as Gerald named the bull, was winning many ribbons. One was a grand champion he won at Richmond. Usually Frank, Beth, and myself would go along with Gerald and Abdul in a trailer behind the car. These were exciting trips, for it seemed that Abdul never let us down, and Gerald came home with many ribbons. Gerald had the honor of being in the top judging team to travel to Kansas City, Kansas, to judge in a national livestock show. We all were very proud of him. It seemed that MD was always too busy with the crops to accompany us on these trips to the livestock shows. I have often thought of how much he missed. No matter how one looked at it, wash day was drudgery. MD filled a huge boiler with water from the well and put it on the stove to heat. When scalding hot, it was emptied with buckets into a hand-turned washer. If it was winter, the steam collected on the windows and wall, filling the house with clamminess, obliterating the outside view. Each batch of clothes had to be turned every 15 minutes, and it seemed there was no end to the soiled clothes. After being washed and rinsed, they were hung on the clothesline to dry, in cold or hot weather, no matter. Then they were dampened down overnight. It took all the next day to iron them with irons heated on a hot stove. There were many white shirts to be ironed until they were free of wrinkles. This was quite an undertaking. The summer was a time of hard work. Horses were used to plant and harvest the crops. The days were long and hot. The crops were irrigated with water from a canal which sometimes, because of washouts or landslides, was dry when the crops needed it most. Hay was loaded on hay racks by hand. Beets were thinned and topped by back-breaking labor. Trips to town to buy groceries and needful things for the farm were few and far between. We made do with what we had, especially edibles. Boredom was a thing unknown. A day's work began at sunrise and sometimes ended long after dark. There were discouragements. Some years crops failed. A season's back-breaking work had been for nothing, but he who loves the land can face failure and begin again in the springtime with new hope. A certain peace and tranquility clothes everything, and as night came softly, though desperately weary, we knew an inward joy of accomplishment. Our first winter on the farm had been quite an experience. The only money we had all winter was $25. We traveled by team and sleigh. We used coal oil lamps, coal stoves, ate canned fruit and vegetables, our own milk and eggs. Gerald and Beth were both babies. I think this winter was as happy as any we knew in all our married life. One of our main crops was sugar beets. As the children became older, they worked hard in the fields, thinning the beets. As they inched slowly along the long, hot rows of beets, I think the only thing that kept them going was dreaming of what they would do with the money they earned, such as a trip to California, which never materialized. Beth was at the age where she was very conscious of her skin. She put layers of cream and powder on her face to protect her from sunburn and wore huge floppy hats, from which underneath 2 eyes peered like steel points from a deathly white mask of powder. Sometimes her boyfriends called unexpectedly, which caused her much embarrassment and amused her brothers. One must truly love the outdoors, the soil, and the beauty of God's creation to be able to stand the rigors of farm life as it was in those days. And yet we knew an independence, a freedom of spirit which is known only by one close to the soil, an independence unknown to the city dweller. The peace and beauty of the fields at twilight, a piece of land, a house which is truly one's own. Often winter came to the farm with great gustiness and loud shrieking of winds, flinging new snow everywhere, frightening the cattle until they ran wildly for shelter with their tails in the air and bellowing loudly. Other times it came quietly and gently, covering the fields and buildings with a blanket of white, like a benediction of peace. Although we were busy, we found time for church and civic work. MD had been head of the Carpenters Union, also the genealogy organization in the 3rd Ward, where he was accomplishing much. I had worked in the Relief Society presidency and the primary. How I enjoyed going with my lovable and sweet youngsters. Later, I worked on the Oneida Stake Primary Board. Gerald had received a scholarship to the University of Idaho at Moscow, Idaho, and would be entering in the fall. I shall never forget the sadness and joy I knew the bright autumn day as I took him to the bus, his first going away to college. We had always been so close in our feeling for one another. As I went home after seeing him off, a great chasm of emptiness filled me. The only thing that saves one at these times is the fact that life has a way of sweeping one up into its arms, and we swirl along on life's great river of living. The emptiness is somewhat allayed until the next child leaves, and so goes life, while a great pride on one's offspring swells within the heart. Perhaps I was too sensitive when it came to parting with loved ones. MD and myself had come from families so different. Mine was always very close, never afraid to show their love for one another. His was directly opposite, never showing affection. Even though they felt it, it was impossible for them to express it. This made it difficult for both of us. There was a great void in which I felt lost and yearned for close adult companionship and understanding. I had found out when we were first married of MD's great love for reading. When I talked to him, it seemed as if he never listened. At these times, I completely gave myself to the worship of nature and my little ones. But life was good, and our children grew up all too quickly. Gerald was in college. Beth had grown into a sweet young lady, was in high school, busy with her studies, social life, her clubs and teas. She and I so enjoyed going to the Girl Day teas, which were popular then. The mothers were invited, and it seemed as though, because of Beth, I usually poured. These teas were quite the affairs and important to the girls and their mothers. Beth's first formal was a white one. How pretty she looked in it. In her last year in high school, she was secretary in the student body organization and associate editor of the senior yearbook. We were proud of our children. I shall never forget how our hearts almost burst with pride as Gerald walked across the stage to receive his graduation diploma from high school. We had bought him a new suit for the occasion. When Beth was a sophomore in high school, I met with a serious accident. Our friends and MD and I were having a coasting and sleighing party. I fell, hitting my head. For 8 days, I lay unconscious in the hospital, hovering between life and death. When I finally became conscious, I realized there was not much hope for recovery, for I had suffered a concussion. The realization that I may leave my little ones and MD, Paul, who was yet a tiny boy, and my other dear ones, was an agonizing thought. Grandmother Nuffer, MD's mother, came each morning at 6 o'clock to relieve MD, who had stayed with me during the night, and must go home to do the chores and get the children off to school. This must have been a difficult time for all. Belle was always a good little mother to the younger ones. Gerald was in college. At these times, Grandmother Nuffer held my hands and cried. How awful this must have been for her. It was she who told me later, "You would never have lived if you hadn't fought so hard to stay with your little ones." Through it all, I was aware of my parents and brother Frank, who had passed away some years before. Their presence was with me continually. They were holding out their arms to me, wanting me to come with them. It was as if I were on the borderline of two worlds. A peace, a great calmness and serenity came with them from that other world. I could so easily have given up. I saw my children, little Paul who needed me so, the others, their faces pleading with me not to leave them. I had no strength. As MD slept beside me on a hospital cot, I suddenly became very lucid and wide awake. Although the room was very dark, I was aware of a sudden brightness, a light near the ceiling in the right side of the room. A voice or presence called, and with great certainty said, "You are not going now. You have a work to do." I felt something in the upper back of my head suddenly move downward through my neck and apparently dissolve. After this experience, I was not frightened. I was calm and knew I would get better. From that moment, I began to improve. My despair left, and I slowly became stronger. I had to learn to walk again. After many months, I began to feel like my old self. This incident, as are others I have experienced in my lifetime, is very sacred to me, and the memory and surety of its happening is as vivid today as it was the time it happened. Some years later, when I had completely regained my health, our second girl was born, the first one of our babies to be born in a hospital. We had wanted another girl, and it seemed too good to be true. I knew she would be a girl, for a few months before she was born. I saw her in a very impressive dream. Not as she looked at birth, but strangely the exact image she was at 5 years of age, with blonde ringlets and smiling countenance. I remember the day MD brought us home from the hospital. The children were in school. It was a warm autumn day. Cicadas were singing in the fields, and tomatoes in the garden lay juicy and red on the vines. Everywhere was sunshine, and our hearts were filled with happiness. When she was a month old, her daddy blessed her and gave her the name Joan Marilyn. Beth would be graduating from high school in the spring. Frank had grown tall and blond and was doing well in school. Paul was nearing 10 years and had many projects going. Gerald was in college and had married Margaret McGregor, who he had met there. We spent a couple of years in Ogden, where MD worked for the railroad. He was still having trouble with his back ailment. We enjoyed living in Ogden. We made many friends. I especially enjoyed reviewing my book of poems, Down Happiness Road, which I was asked to do many times for different women's clubs. I was always surprised at how well they were received by the women who heard them. These poems were the outpouring of my heart for the goodness of life. Gerald had temporarily taken over the farm. Their son David was our first grandchild. Beth had married Mark Carter. They had moved to Montana. My heart ached for her. She seemed so far away. Soon we were to have our second grandchild, Camille Carter, a little blonde beauty. World affairs had been tense among nations. Hitler had extended his borders. In 1939, World War II started as Germany and Russia invaded Poland. Sit-down strikes had been outlawed by the United States Supreme Court. In 1940, Sir Winston Churchill, as new Prime Minister, offered Parliament and the English people nothing but blood, seat, and tears. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was serving his third term as president. In 1941, the United States entered the war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. In 1943, Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in North Africa, and yet to come in 1945, the atomic bomb would be dropped on Japan to speed the end of the war. President Roosevelt would die. His death would be a great loss to his country and the world. Throughout the Depression and war years, he had restored people's confidence and taught them that fear itself was their greatest enemy. Harry Truman, taking his place as president, was to make the great decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Little did we know it, but a great change would soon come into our lives. We had already said goodbye to Gerald and Margaret and their 2 little sons. Gerald had received a fellowship to the university in Columbia, Missouri, to work with the well-known Dr. Stadler in the field of genetics. Gerald and Margaret were embarked on what was to be their life's project, where they would receive many honors as well as do a lifetime of good with their church work. Much later, Gerald was to serve in the presidency of the Central States Mission of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. MD's mother had died October 25, 1945. His father died June 4th, 1946, while we were living in Ogden. Grandfather Nuffer's death was like the death of a great oak. My father had died in January 1939, and Mother had died in May 1938. At both funerals, the chapels were full to overflowing. My brother Frank had died 1 month to the day after Mother's death. His was a sad death. He seemed so alone without any family. The day we buried Mother, he stood beside her grave, saying to the rest of us, "When I die, I want to be buried here beside Mother." Little did he know that in a month he would be buried there. Frank was with me the last 2 weeks before he died, and even though it broke my heart to see him ill, it was like old times when we were young and at our parents' home. I think both of us pretended just a little bit that we were young again. We had a happy but sad 2 weeks together. My brother Clifford met with a tragic accident in August 1941 when a live electric wire fell on him as he was working, leaving the 3 of us alive. My brother Glenn and sister Mabel and myself at this writing in 1976. Life is a book with many chapters. We were still to know other changes. The days on the farm with our little ones were gone. Soon we would step into a new life or world, which was to have much effect on all of us. Throughout my life, I have found for some unexplainable reason the things I think about often come to pass. One evening on the farm, as I walked alone in the twilight, I found myself thinking so strongly that I actually spoke the thoughts aloud. Someday I would like to live in a mission field. Why I would think or say such a thing I do not know. I had never had thoughts of this kind. It seemed it came of a sudden. We had just paid the last payment on the mortgage of our farm. For years we had looked forward to this very day when we were out of debt and could enjoy ourselves more, buy some of the things we had always wanted but never could afford. We had all made many sacrifices for this time. We could now enjoy the harvest of our years of hard work and sacrifice. I had forgotten the walk in the twilight and my thoughts until some time later. We had sold our farm and house and were building a house in town in the Preston First Ward, as we were not sure where we were going next. We all felt that this was just a temporary phase of our life. It was as if we were suspended, waiting for we knew not what. The tears flowed freely as I said goodbye to the farm. It looked more beautiful than I had ever seen it. The lilacs were in full bloom, the grass and spring wheat so green and luxuriant. I had lived here most of my life, and everything about it was dear to me. The paths and fields where I had followed at my father's side as he worked. Later, the fields and River Hill where my own children had spent many happy hours. But, regardless of tears, life goes on from one day to another. We finished building our house in town. Frank had come home from attending college in Moscow, Idaho, had fulfilled a mission, and was home now and going to college at Utah State in Logan. He was excelling in dramatics and was Sunday school superintendent in the Preston First Ward. There is a true story, which is interesting. A short time previous, as I have said, Frank had returned from his mission, as was the case of his 2 friends, Garth Eames and Heber Swayston. A small town such as Preston always has a great need of people with energetic spirit and enthusiasm. The 3 were doing such good work with the young people of the community. Their influence was being felt by all, old and young. World War II was being fought, and young men were being drafted. When their names came up, they were ready to leave. However, the draft board members thought differently, for they met together and after much deliberation said, "The community of Preston can't spare these young men. Their influence for good is needed by all." They never went. Later, Frank joined the Air Force, graduated and served as first lieutenant. Paul was in high school and was music manager of the high school orchestra, as well as having first chair in the violin section. We had many happy times going to music festivals throughout the state. Marilyn, a little yellow curled girl, was going to school and was happy with her friends. Gerald and Beth were busy and happy in their new life with their little families and the business of living. MD was doing well in his occupation of building, and I was busy in civic and church affairs, being president of the Franklin County Daughters of Utah Pioneers, with 13 camps and a board member of the Franklin Stake Primary Organization. Without our realizing it, we had settled into a pattern of living, and we were all quite happy. Sometimes it's as if we are moved by an unseen hand, that our lives are guided by a force other than our own. We do things that affect our lives deeply, even painfully, but we don't know why, nor can we explain. We sold our home and moved to Montana, breaking all ties, leaving old and dear associations behind, selling all our property. As we entered the Gallatin Valley in 1949, it looked foreign and strange, but like a jewel set in pine-fringed and snow-capped mountains. The Spanish peaks to the south rose snow-glazed like pointed pearls into a blue sky. For the Gallatin Valley, regardless of cold winters and late springs, has more than its share of clear days with sunlit skies and is a paradise for nature lovers, fishermen, and hunters. I could not see its beauty. For my heart was in the place we had left, where we had lived a rather sheltered life. How could this have happened, I thought? It was as if all the dear roots of my life had been pulled from me. I was to learn, painfully, that the old associations, the atmosphere can never be the same. There are new associations. The old is gone forever. One can never go back, but always ahead to new horizons. We had to start all over. We bought land and were in debt again and among strange people. In fact, we were in the mission field in more ways than we could ever imagine. I thought of the Twilight Walk so long ago. There was only a handful of Mormons. There was no chapel to meet in, only a small rented clubhouse where tobacco fumes assailed our senses as we met in Sunday school. What a difference to that ward we had left in Preston with an 1,100 membership, where we had been so active, and where we had worshipped our Bishop Eberhard. I asked myself why we had uprooted our placid life for this. I was homesick with a sickness that gripped my whole being, even though Beth lived near. I never realized that I would have such a hard time adjusting to a new life. Again, we were swept up as a broken limb is swirled about in a mighty river. We had no choice. There was a new chapel to be built, with not a man in the area experienced enough in building to shoulder such a responsibility other than MD. The Mormons who had lived there for 25 years were quite content with what they had, and said the undertaking was too great for such a small membership. It just couldn't be done, they said. I remember well how MD, Mark Carter, our son-in-law, and one or two other stalwarts fought tenaciously for the project. Soon a new chapel was being erected with MD as the supervisor. What a blessing for all the members. After the issue was definitely decided and permission by the church authorities was given, the few members joined together in a close-knit bond of love and determination, all working for the same thing. Their efforts to raise money were blessed tenfold. Wonders were performed. There were many problems, but all were overcome. A new chapel soon lifted its shining spires heavenward. Converts and investigators began to fill the chapel. God works in mysterious ways his wonders to perform. Sometimes we are not able to judge what is best for us. I had worked many years in Preston, in all phases of primary work. When we left, I had given away all the material I had collected through the years, saying I was through with primary work. There was no primary organization in the Bozeman branch. I was called to be president of a new primary organization. I thanked the Lord for the long experience I had had and diligently went to work. The result was a successful primary being held each week with officers and teachers more faithful and enthusiastic than I had witnessed in all my years of primary work. This was a wonderful experience to me to see these inexperienced young women take up their work with such vigor. When we left Idaho, Paul and Frank had stayed behind. Frank was in college at USU Logan. Sometimes we traveled many miles from Bozeman to Logan to see the many plays he was in. He was superintendent of the College Institute. How precious were these experiences. Paul later came to Bozeman and graduated from high school. The next year, he was at the USU at Logan and playing his violin in the college symphony orchestra. Each autumn and after each vacation as they returned to college, I watched them go, waving to them and smiling a goodbye. But my heart was heavy with loneliness. I was still homesick. The environment was so different than in Idaho. I had belonged to the Idaho League of Writers and missed it and many other things. One Sunday, I rode to Butte with some priesthood members to leadership meeting, leaving my car in town. It was the usual long, hard trip, which I hadn't yet become accustomed to. As we arrived back in Bozeman, I got into my car on North 7th alone. As I turned the corner and started east on Main, I was suddenly aware of a presence, surrounded by a bright light in the upper right side of the car and in a small area of the sky to the right front of the car. A great calmness and serenity came with it which words cannot explain. A presence as calm and certain as the sun, saying or making me understand that my homesickness and anxiety was as nothing. The only important thing on earth, this was impressed on me deeply, was the gospel to be spread over the whole earth. At that moment, I seemed to be standing on the ground looking to the west. I saw a great body of water, which consumed everything, roll in from the south like a huge tidal wave, which was the gospel. When it had completely consumed Belgrade and the area west, it receded back to the south and disappeared. I drove home in a daze. I was deeply affected, as if part of me was in another world. The surety of it, its warmth and serenity almost consumed me. Tuesday, as I drove my car through the streets of Bozeman, I distinctly felt this feeling of peace and warmth, which possessed me, being drained from me against my will, leaving me weak, but with a surety of what had happened. I have tried through the years to find words to explain this experience to loved ones, but words are futile. Its happening is as vivid today as it was then. Marilyn, who had been unhappy changing schools, had found a teacher who was a real friend and was doing well in school and would soon be a young lady. MD was again busy building a new chapel at Three Forks, Montana. I remember he left his farming, and it seemed he almost had to neglect things at home as he traveled each morning to his building. I also remember the wheat crop we harvested that year was the best we had ever grown. Later, we built a lovely home in town, selling the house we had in the country, but keeping our land. Our new home was at a Lyreworth by a beautiful park. Soon after, MD was called to Marshalltown, Iowa, to build a chapel for a few struggling but faithful members of the church. Marilyn and I spent one summer there with him. What a wonderful experience. The people were lovable and kind to us, and we have never forgotten them. Marilyn spent some of this time with Gerald's family in Columbia, Missouri. It seemed that as soon as MD finished one chapel, there would be another one for him to build. He built one at Superior, Montana, and at Townsend, Montana. They were all finely built. The love and appreciation of the people he built them for, we were never to forget. After graduation from college, Frank went into the Air Force as a first lieutenant. Paul was married to Alice Schwent and living in Bozeman, west of the home we had built there. After a few years, Frank had married Cynthia Hepburn and was living in Bozeman after leaving Detroit, where they had lived a short time after their marriage. Beth and family were living near, up Bridger Canyon. How we enjoyed them. We had all of our family near us, except Gerald, who now had his doctorate degree in genetics and was affiliated with the college in Columbia, Missouri, where he was teaching and doing research work. Years before, I had gone through the loneliness of his leaving. Each time the youngsters became old enough to go to college, it seemed as if that was the breaking of the cord that bound them to us, and my heart always bled a little. But now most of us were together again. How happy were our holidays and Sundays. MD, it seemed, had come to the end of building chapels and was doing private contracting. I was busy now in the presidency of the Butte Stake Relief Society. Our family was engaged in church work. Our son-in-law, Mark Carter, had been made bishop. He and Beth had moved to Montana before us and had helped much in building the morale of the few saints residing there. The little handful of saints had grown into a ward. It was rather different than in Preston, where we had walked 2 blocks to our leadership meetings. We were now riding 100 miles to the same meeting. Marilyn was ready to graduate from high school, where she had been very popular, running for queen of the different clubs, etc. We were enjoying our children and grandchildren. Sundays, after church, our house was usually filled with grandchildren. We had many family dinners, and life was good with our loved ones. We felt quite prosperous, and had again settled into a pattern of living with happiness and security. But again, our lives were interrupted by a greater change than ever. New horizons were opening to us. A telephone call came from Salt Lake City from Brother Mendenhall, who was head of the church building committee. I answered it, and he asked for MD, inquiring whether he could speak German. I said probably some and promised to get him on the telephone as soon as possible. Sensing something important was happening. It was a call to Germany on a building mission. We were all stunned, happy, and couldn't believe it was true. Our family was happy for us and helped in every way possible so that we would be ready to leave in the short time we had, 5 weeks. We were advised to sell our beautiful home, as we would be gone at least 3 years. We were told to make a trip to Salt Lake, which we did, to receive all the instructions and advice as to what to take with us, etc. How hard we worked to get ready, to clear the house of my cherished possessions, to pack, store, and mark them. Marilyn's graduation was coming up and was an important occasion to all of us. MD had to finish a building he was doing. I was so busy I never realized the full significance of our leaving, that it would mean the breaking up of our dear family relations, Sunday and holiday dinners together. Camille, our oldest granddaughter, had been at our house so often. She usually came after school. She would stick her head in the door and say, "Can I stay overnight?" How we loved her. She and Marilyn were like sisters. After packing and storing our household belongings, luckily we had a steel granary on the farm where they were to be stored for almost 7 years. Little did we know the length of time as we packed them carefully away. The stake held a farewell party in our honor, and my Relief Society workers gave me a lovely party and presented me with Robert Frost's book of poems. With Marilyn's graduation over, we bid goodbye to our friends and family. We left by plane from the Butte Airport June 15, 1961, staying overnight at Salt Lake City, where Mabel and Ralph had come from Elko, Nevada, to see us off. We were set apart for our mission by Elder Harold B. Lee of the Council of the 12. And the next morning, we boarded a huge jet for New York City and from there to Frankfurt, Germany. 3 innocents, little dreaming of the things that would happen to us in the 3 years ahead.